An explosive reaction from the Kremlin. Putin threatens to bring back negotiations. A daring operation by the SBU has simply finished off the Kremlin, and Trump has added fuel to the fire. His statement is blowing up the internet. The American leader either publishes details of his call with the Kremlin's master or suddenly deletes them from social media. What is happening behind the scenes of global politics, and how could all this end? All the shocking details right now.
The latest nonsense from the Russian dictator. Putin has appeared in public with yet another round of cynical and absurd statements directed at the Kyiv regime.
He doesn't need peace at all. For him, peace most likely means losing power. And for this regime, it seems, power is more important than peace or human lives.
In his speech, the dictator once again called Ukrainian authorities illegitimate and claimed they are turning into a terrorist organization. Look who's talking, a man who's been deliberately killing the Ukrainian people for 11 years.
The already illegitimate regime in Kyiv, which once seized power, is gradually turning into a terrorist organization, and its sponsors are becoming accomplices to terrorists.
Putin also accused Ukraine of sabotaging railway tracks in the Bryansk and Kursk regions, calling it a terrorist act aimed at disrupting the negotiation process in Istanbul.
The decision to commit such crimes, of course, was made in Ukraine at the political level. All the crimes that were committed against civilians, including women and children, on the eve of another round of peace talks we proposed in Istanbul, were undoubtedly aimed at disrupting the negotiation process.
The dictator also did not miss the opportunity to praise the Russian delegation participating in the negotiations, while at the same time criticizing the Ukrainian representatives.
This level can only be assessed by those people, those experts, who themselves possess unquestionable authority and a high level of competence. What kind of authority can the leaders of a thoroughly rotten and completely corrupt regime possibly have?
Putin also made it clear that he does not intend to cease fire and cast doubt on the continuation of negotiations to end the war. Although this is already obvious, the Kremlin dictator does not want peace.
The Kyiv leadership has resorted to organizing terrorist acts, and at the same time is asking to suspend hostilities for 30 or even 60 days. They are requesting a meeting at the highest level. But how can such meetings be held under these circumstances? What is there to talk about? Who even negotiates with those who rely on terror, with terrorists?
Putin, speaks in a way that resonates with the sentiments of a segment of the pro-war Russian audience. At least 30% of Russians fanatically support Putin's actions regarding Ukraine, this genocidal bloody war. And of course, he needs to present himself somehow using categorical, radical, hysterical statements to align himself, yes, with these kinds of sentiments. The second point is, of course, a signal to the United States of America, because Ukraine has demonstrated vulnerability, and the vulnerability of a strategic nature at that.
The fact that Putin is not ready for a ceasefire in the near future was also stated by the American President Donald Trump. He wrote on his social network that he spoke with Putin for more than an hour. They discussed the SBU strikes on Russia's strategic aviation. According to Trump, Putin told him that he would be forced to respond to this. However, after some time, the head of the White House deleted the post, then published it again without any changes, and then reposted an article about sanctions.
For Trump, the current situation as a whole is one that requires him to define his position. Moreover, this self-determination should concern the Russia-Ukraine war in a way that properly aligns with America's interests, the sentiments of American voters and citizens, and the interests of transatlantic security. And yet, Trump does not want to follow this path, which is currently being shaped by logic and reason.
Similarly, during a phone conversation with the US president, dictator Putin offered his services as a mediator in negotiations with Iran.
If Russia allows pressure to be put on Iran to achieve the version of the nuclear deal that the US wants, whether that means stopping uranium enrichment or more effective control over uranium enrichment, which is being proposed in the form of a so-called regional consortiums, and in return, of course, Trump would have to provide some kind of service to Russia. And there is a very high probability and risk that this service will be related to putting pressure on Kyiv.
And on top of that, the Kremlin moth had a phone conversation with the Pope telling him how he wants to resolve the war in Ukraine. That's quite a twist. Putin is playing different roles for his own benefit.
Exclusive. Russia was preparing a terrorist attack against Ukraine. The Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, foiled the terrifying plot. SBU chief Vasil Malyuk reported the enemy was planning to assassinate key Ukrainian leaders. The details of the Kremlin's plans will surprise you. Find out all the hottest details next.
Russia was preparing an assassination attempt on key Ukrainian figures. This was revealed by SBU chief Vasil Malyuk.
In the past 3 years, we have uncovered 102 enemy agent networks. Among them are top-level networks. Among these top agents are even those who plan to eliminate our commander-in-chief, the president of Ukraine.
Malyuk noted that the Russians are targeting not only top officials, but also ordinary people. The head of the SBU spoke about an agent network that was preparing a terrorist attack in one of the capital's hypermarkets after 6 p.m., essentially during rush hour, when most people come to shop.
Explosive devices were supposed to go off there, placed in areas where flammable mixtures are stored.
Terrorist attacks are being carried out on Ukrainian territory against Ukrainian citizens in rear areas. Of course, there are individual acts of sabotage when something needs to be blown up or destroyed that has significant value or plays an important role in supplying army units. That's all clear. The second component is to kill as many civilians as possible in the rear areas. Yes, this doesn't directly affect the front lines, but it creates panic and generates new tension within society.
These and other crimes committed by Russians have been documented by our intelligence officers, as well as attempts to artificially implicate our country in crimes it did not commit.
Ukraine has repeatedly been accused of having a negative influence not only within the country on internal processes, but also on processes far beyond its borders. Please recall the rumors that the Russian Federation actively spread, claiming that the aid coming to Ukraine from Western European countries, the weapons, the Stingers, the Javelin supply to Ukraine were allegedly being resold by Ukraine's corrupt regime and ending up in Western European countries. And that this would supposedly lead to rising crime there and so on and so forth. All of this happened, but none of it was confirmed. It was the Russian special services playing games. Now there are accusations that Ukraine is allegedly preparing some kind of sabotage against its own allies in order to blame the Russian Federation. But these accusations don't hold up to any scrutiny because Ukraine simply does not act against its allies by definition. How can you bite the hand that is reaching out to help you? I can't even imagine it. That's Russia's doctrine, not Ukraine's.
Also, according to Malyuk, the enemy planned an assassination attempt on him and the head of the main intelligence directorate, Kyrilo Budanov, last Easter.
I would like to bring up something interesting. For the first time, almost on the third anniversary, the top leadership of the Russian Federation realized what a terrible mistake they made back in 2022. They were working back in 2022. Why was it terrible? Because they understood that they had based everything on completely false data. This is a failure of their intelligence services, which in turn were, let's say, relying on information from agents who were working here in Ukraine. But in reality, large sums of money were simply being written off for this.
Vasil Malyuk noted that the Russians are constantly trying to destabilize the situation in Ukraine using agents. He cannot share the details, but assured that the operational situation in Ukraine is fully under control.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Russia's losses are catastrophic. The number of those killed is many times higher than people think. International analysts are sounding the alarm, and even in Russia, they are starting to realize this. The Russian army is on the verge of collapse. There is almost no one left to recruit. The number of people willing to sign contracts to go to the front is rapidly declining, and the payments are visibly shrinking. The Kremlin is facing a complete budget collapse. The money for the war is running out, and this is only the beginning. What awaits Russia next? Watch to find out.
Torture, slave labor, and how, in the end, Russia uses convicted Ukrainian citizens as bargaining chips. No one in the world has ever done anything like this before. Horrifying details emerged after a recent prisoner exchange when the Russian side returned former inmates instead of civilian captives.
You see, never in all of recorded history throughout the ages, as far as I am aware, has it ever happened that prisoners were stolen
Oletsivili helps those who have served their sentences return home. According to him, after the full-scale invasion, about 3,500 Ukrainians who were in pre-trial detention centers and penal colonies ended up under occupation. Among them were many who were behind bars awaiting the end of investigations, and even those whom the court had already granted parole. But at one point they became prisoners. The Russians used the prison population as slaves. They were forcibly put to work on construction projects, for example. The new pre-trial detention center in Chonhar and housing for staff were built by Ukrainian inmates, as well as defensive fortifications.
They were also forced to clean up illegal detention facilities. These were some basements where civilian prisoners were held. As a rule, these were government employees or people connected to the armed forces of Ukraine or their relatives. There, they were abused, and our inmates were used to clean up the remains of urine, feces, saliva, and blood, all the horrors left after torture or destroy the evidence. They didn't just clean up, they used acid to destroy the traces.
In addition, according to the human rights activists, prisoners in occupied Kherson were forced to loot local businesses and government institutions. It was with the prisoners' hands that the Russians loaded up everything they managed to take before their retreat. The convicts essentially became a cover for the Russian army. From the occupied territories, the invaders deported about 2,000 people to Russia. In a recent exchange, about 24 of them were returned to Ukraine. One of them, Maxim, shows the marks from dog bites inflicted by the Russians.
They took everyone out to the yard, lined us up against the wall, and started beating us. I can't even describe it to you when there are 1,000 people in the prison and 1,000 people are screaming almost at the same time.
Among those whom the Russians passed off instead of civilian prisoners are people who were serving sentences for criminal cases in Russia or in territories under its control. Ukrainian citizens who are former inmates are usually left without any documents by the Russians. After being released, they are placed in detention centers and in fact end up imprisoned again. The people in this video are exactly those kinds of individuals. One of them suffered 4 strokes while in such a center.
2 years disabled.
You had a stroke, right?
A stroke.
What, 4 months?
4 strokes.
The other people are simply Ukrainian citizens who, even before the full-scale invasion, were in Russia, committed some kind of crime, served their sentence, and were supposed to be simply expelled, deported. Previously, they used to easily take these people out through third countries, like Lithuania or Georgia. People who deported themselves would put them in police vans, bring them to the border with Georgia, and expel them. For the past 3 or 4 months, they stopped doing this and started accumulating people in order to use them so cynically now.
Convicted Ukrainian citizens are yet another category that the Russian occupation machine processes. They are actively trying to recruit them into the aggressor's army and create propaganda images. Currently, human rights activists are collecting testimonies from former prisoners and initiating investigations so that materials on the deportation and use of forced labor of inmates will appear before the International Criminal Court.
That's all for now, and as always, for more breaking news from the front, please be sure to tune in to our next episode